Hi, everyone. It's Brian Katulis at the Center for American Progress. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us for this discussion on what's next for U.S. policy in the Middle East. Before I introduce the panel, I want to welcome you to join the conversation. You can submit questions. There's a function on the side of the screen there where you can hit the chat function and submit a question, or you can do it on Twitter at the hashtag US policy in the Middle East. Hope you and your families are healthy and staying well. I know I feel fortunate to be at the Center for American Progress to continue doing what we're doing, especially at a time when so many people are not as fortunate to be able to continue working. And I want to offer a special thanks to our events team and our digital strategy teams for helping us all come together in this platform for what I think will be a really interesting discussion. The Middle East program at the Center for American Progress has been doing discussions like this for years, for more than 15 years or so, trying to offer analysis on complicated situations in the Middle East, and today's discussion will cover a lot of that territory. If there's an aim in this discussion and the work that we do, it's to raise the quality of the debate. I think it's important to try to do that at a time when there are so many voices and so many forums in cable TV and social media, even the White House briefing room, that have lowered the quality of debate. And today, we're especially lucky to have a very distinguished panel of friends and colleagues to talk about this question of what's next in the Middle East. I'm going to introduce the panel, and as I mentioned, you can submit questions. We're going to go until about 1 o'clock Eastern time today. I'll have a conversation with our panelists here for the next 30 minutes or so, but we'll take into account the questions you offer up online, either at hashtag US policy in the Middle East or in the chat function. I'm going to introduce the panel in the order of speakers. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Dan Shapiro, joining us all the way from Israel. He's a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and he served in many positions in the US government. He was US ambassador to Israel from 2011 to 2017. We're lucky to have Dan join us all the way from Israel. Second is Ghaith al-Omari, who's currently a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ghaith has been a friend of the center for many, many years and was part of a lot of our deliberations. He previously served in an advisory capacity to the Palestinian Authority, and he has a forthcoming paper on the key question of Palestinian leadership succession. And then last but not least is my colleague Mara Rudman, who is currently Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. We're lucky to have Mara back at the center. She and I worked for several years together in the early inceptions of Middle East Progress and our Middle East program, and Mara served in many senior level positions in the Clinton and Obama administrations, including Deputy Envoy for Middle East Peace in the first Obama administration. I want to start the discussion with Dan and with current events. Dan, we saw yesterday Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu expressing that he was confident that the United States will allow Israel to annex parts of the West Bank in an address that he delivered to a conference. And wanted to get your take on the state of play there. There's a unity government that was announced last week. I know that's still a work in progress in terms of the details. And it has some details about the possibility of annexation, but I thought maybe you could start the discussion by walking us through the current state of play inside of Israel and how it relates to the Palestinians and the rest of the region.
Sure. Thanks, Brian, and thank you to Center for American Progress and all the attendees. And it's great to be with Ghaith and Mara as well on this panel. So indeed, an agreement was announced about 10 days ago for a unity government with Likud and half of Blue and White, the main challenging party, which split over the question of whether to join with Netanyahu. It's led by Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff of the IDF. You're correct, it's not final. the agreement is very complex, rather convoluted, and it requires a number of changes to the Israeli basic law, sort of their pseudo-constitution. First, there's the question, and a lot of these can be challenged in the Supreme Court. First, there's the question of whether Netanyahu, who has indictments pending against him, is actually permitted to form a government. Then there are questions about having this prime minister, an alternative prime minister structure between he and Gantz before their 18-month rotation. Provisions in which the Knesset would be superseded and automatically going to new elections if various scenarios happen. So the courts will have to sort that out. This will probably take another couple of weeks, but I assume it is likely the government will be sworn in. And it's, again, a very convoluted government. There are many different views within it on different subjects. It's actually designed to promote stalemate as well as this 18-month rotation and require consensus or give each side a veto over the other side's policies. And they've stated that for the first 6 months, the only subject that this government will deal with are emergency responses to the coronavirus crisis, both the health and the economic crisis, with one exception. And the one exception, as you stated, is the issue of Israeli unilateral annexation of the West Bank, or portions of the West Bank, or as some Israelis refer to it, applying Israeli law to parts of the West Bank, mostly meaning Israeli settlements and the Jordan Valley. There's not much of a distinction between annexation and applying Israeli law, but those are different terminologies. What it says about that is that as of July 1st, which is about 2 months into the life of this government, Netanyahu, on his own, without needing Gantz's approval, may bring before the cabinet or before the Knesset a vote on the issue of unilateral annexation. He is required to consult with Gantz. He is actually required in the coalition agreement to be in agreement with President Trump or with the United States government, meaning the US government will give its approval and be willing to recognize it. And then there's some non-binding words about him also needing to consult with security experts and consider regional and international reactions. So this, of course, is something that Netanyahu ran on. He was very excited about it. He said it again in this address to evangelical conference yesterday. It's something his political base is very excited about, and it's something that is forecast and promised in the Trump plan that was issued at the end of January, that Israel could annex portions of the West Bank, about 30% of the West Bank, and have the United States recognize it. And if it does, if it actually carries through that, it's a very serious blow to what are probably already poor, maybe declining prospects for two states. And so it's something to be concerned about from a US policy perspective, at least as I see it. I would say it's not automatic that it's going to happen. And there are a number of factors that could go into whether or not it will actually occur or not. And I'll briefly just identify the four key factors as I see them. One is the Israeli political dynamic, and that largely points toward the annexation happening within the next few months, whether on July 1st or sometime later in the summer or early fall. Gantz essentially made the decision to go into a unity government to address the coronavirus emergency. In doing so, he sacrificed an enormous amount of leverage in the subsequent negotiations. Netanyahu deeply wants to capitalize on the Trump peace plan and fulfill that promise to his base of annexation, and it's a tantalizing legacy for him. And Gantz, while he's lukewarm on annexation and he's raised concerns about doing unilateral measures or how the Palestinians would react or how Jordan would react or international reaction, he knows that there is actually a majority in the Knesset, including members of his own party, that support annexation, and it seems unlikely that he's going to throw himself in front of that train. So that's the first factor. The second, of course, is what would be the reaction of key regional players, particularly the Arab states. There's obviously no enthusiasm in Arab states about the idea of unilateral Israeli annexation, and particularly it's a very sensitive subject in Jordan, which renounced its claim to the West Bank in 1988, but has always never wavered from its support for a Palestinian state arising there. The Jordanian foreign minister has been calling other countries in Europe, in the region, in Asia, to try to get other governments to make statements of opposition to annexation. Several Europeans have already done. If the Jordanian government were to go as far as to make a strong threat about the stability of its peace treaty with Israel, it's possible that that would give Israelis pause. I'd say even more significant, though, than the Jordanian reaction is the Saudi reaction. The Saudis, who have really shown very little interest in the Palestinian issue in recent years, certainly during the Trump years, and have built a quiet partnership with Israel to address Iran and other regional threats that they have in common, could say, I'm not predicting they will, but if they do say, look, we have an oil market collapse, we have a lot of other regional questions going on right now in the wake of this public pandemic, we don't need this problem of another element of instability thrown in the pile. That might be a factor that would slow down Israeli enthusiasm. However, if the Arab states don't go beyond this kind of mild rhetorical opposition, if they seem distracted by their own coronavirus emergencies or the oil market crisis takes them in a different direction of not paying any attention to the Palestinians, if they're still focused on seeking a good relationship with President Trump's administration, I suspect that may not be enough to slow down this train. And Palestinians, well, the Palestinian Authority will almost certainly threaten to suspend security cooperation or maybe even healthcare cooperation if there's annexation. But I think generally in Israel, those threats are dismissed. They've been heard many times before, and I'm not sure, I think that would be dangerous to dismiss them, but I'm not sure that would slow down the train. Two more factors, though, I think may push in the other direction. One is the logic of proceeding before the US election with annexation. Of course, for some supporters of annexation in Israel, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and precisely because there's an election coming and Trump could lose, you don't want to squander that moment. This is exactly the moment when annexation must occur. But there are many other Israelis who are asking the question, would it be foolhardy to rush forward with that decision, knowing perhaps that Trump would recognize it, but that if Biden wins, if Joe Biden is elected, it could leave Israel in a very awkward position with the incoming administration. Joe Biden has expressed his own opposition to annexation, as has virtually every Democratic public official in Congress and elsewhere. He's said it in his video that he submitted at the AIPAC conference. And so the question very much hangs in the air. What would a Biden administration do if they come into office and within a few months before Israel had unilaterally annexed a significant portion of the West Bank and the United States had recognized? Would they withdraw that recognition? Would they look for some other way to balance that decision? And Israeli strategists are asking that question with a certain amount of trepidation. The fourth and last factor, and then I'll close with this, is the technical and political challenges of actually preparing to implement annexation. There's some technical aspects about it, the difficulty of getting what's been a joint mapping committee that's been appointed between the US and Israel to actually get out into the field and do the work while people are doing social distancing, while it's difficult to travel. That's a small piece of it. There's another piece of it, which is that once this is actually brought to a debate in the cabinet, Benny Gantz, who will be also serving as defense minister, will for the first time enable the voices of the IDF leadership and other security officials in Israel who are quite lukewarm, if not opposed to annexation, because they will have the difficult task of defending these new and very convoluted borders. Their voice will be brought to the table for the first time in this debate. But there's one last piece, which is I think it becomes politically very difficult to actually reach an Israeli consensus and then a US-Israeli agreement on what is to be annexed. There are 128 settlements in the West Bank, some large, some close to the former 1967 lines and what are considered blocks, and maybe even with some expectation that they would eventually be incorporated in Israel in a two-state solution. But many others that are smaller and farther afield and spread out across the West Bank. And then, of course, there's the large swath of the Jordan Valley that's envisioned. And once the Israeli government or this mapping committee try to actually draw the boundaries around these 128 communities that will be annexed, it is almost certain that the leaders of those communities will lobby to have the boundaries of their settlement described in very expansive terms. We've seen this before in other attempts to map limitations on Israeli construction in the West Bank, and that it's difficult for Israelis to determine how limited to make that, because most settlements have a footprint of built-up area and perhaps a fence around it, and then a master plan that describes a much larger physical area. And in aggregate, those would be well over 30%. And I think the internal Israeli debate is actually going to be quite lengthy and quite difficult with a lot of influential political actors weighing in for even Israel to reach its own consensus, much less to come to the United States with something that's actually limited to 30% annexation. So that's another reason I think this may not happen on July 1st, and it may take a lot longer, even if there's a desire for it to happen. So there are pressures pushing for annexation, as I mentioned. There are also a number of different ways it could be delayed and go sideways. I personally would not put my money on any particular outcome just yet.
Great. Thanks, Dan. That was very thorough, and we'll circle back a bit more to the U.S. stance on this and what the debate back here. You mentioned in your opening remarks here the regional reactions, and specifically Jordan. And I know, Ghaith, you've been tracking both the Palestinian leadership and also Jordan and other key regional actors. I wonder if you could give us sort of your sense of how they might react. What are they doing already in anticipation of a possible move? Is there any risk at all to the existing agreements between Israel and some of its neighbors? How do you see this playing out in the next few months?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. And thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone here. Look, I would differentiate between what the actors are doing in preparation and how will they react if there's annexation. And here there are three main actors. There's the PA, there's Hamas, and there are the Jordanians. For the PA, in the short term, I think they're following the usual playbook. They are trying to build international support. I understand that the Arab foreign ministers are meeting on Thursday. They've been contacting the Europeans. The whole objective of this is to create basically beginnings of an international consensus that will be against annexation, that if it happens, you have a united international front that can be activated at a future date. In the meantime, cooperation will continue on the ground, whether it's security cooperation, whether it's the cooperation that we've been seeing on the health sectors, financial, etc. This will continue until we have annexation. When we have annexation, I think things will change very differently. And Dan mentioned that some in Israel dismiss the Palestinian threats. Look, my own sense is, even if Abbas did not want to suspend security coordination, and I suspect that he's not very keen on that, there will be such tremendous political pressure that I just do not see him basically being able to continue with it, at least in the initial period. So on the Palestinian side, on the PA side, I suspect in the short term, we will have life as normal with maybe active diplomacy. But I think if there is annexation, it is impossible to kind of see how politics as normal will continue. Now, will this lead to violence? No one knows. I would not be one to predict it. However, if you end security coordination, then the possibility increases. I mean, security coordination includes many components, one of which is, for example, the PA security forces buffering protesters from friction with Israel, etc. So all of these things, I suspect, will be in play. When it comes to Hamas, in the short term, Hamas's main dynamic with Israel right now relates to prisoner exchanges. This might seem a bit esoteric, but a couple of weeks ago, the Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, hinted that he might be willing to share some information about the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers who are held by Hamas and 2 civilians who are held by Hamas. And we started seeing a process of engagement between Israel and Hamas. So in the medium term, until there is annexation, this will dominate the scene, and neither side would want any escalation. If there is annexation, however, it's very hard to see how Hamas does not respond in a violent way. Now, I don't think Hamas has an interest in an all-out conflict with Israel, and Israel doesn't have an interest in an all-out conflict. So the Hamas response will be within the kind of understood and agreed or implicitly agreed terms or rules of engagement. Certain kinds of Hamas fire will draw certain kind of Israeli fire, and Hamas will be pushing this maybe to its extreme limits. But I think it will try to keep it within a manageable dimensions. This, though, will depend on 2 things. It will depend on how large the Israeli annexation is. I think a major annexation might be different from a minor annexation, but it also depends on how far and how well the prisoner exchange conversation is going. If there is a confluence between a stuck process of prisoner exchange and an annexation, I suspect Hamas will be pushing the envelope a bit further in terms of its response. Again, neither side wants it to turn into a full-out conflict, but these kind of situations have their own inherent risks, and once they start, we don't know how they proceed. In the meantime, when it comes to domestic Palestinian issues, none of this is going to push to unity. We've seen this dynamic play before over and over again. Neither Hamas nor the PA right now have any political logic and political interest in unity, and this will be no exception. Now you move to Jordan. For Jordan, there are three dimensions pre-annexation to the Jordanian reaction. One relates to the peace process. And on this one, the Jordanians will be basically joining ranks with the Palestinians. Jordan will be doing exactly what the Palestinians are doing, will be working on creating a regional and international consensus. Jordan has much more capable foreign policy apparatus, and probably Jordanians will be leading the charge when it comes to this. So when it comes to diplomacy, we will start seeing the beginnings of creating a potential coalition. When it comes to bilateral relation with Israel, though, it will be a bit different. I mean, much of the Jordanian-Israeli tensions that we've seen in recent years relate to really the person of Bibi Netanyahu. There is absolutely no trust in Netanyahu in the Jordanian system from the king downwards. Now that we have a new government, I suspect the Jordanians will be reaching out to the two new known entities, Gantz and Ashkenazi, defense and foreign ministers, to see if in bilateral relations between Jordan and Israel, these two actors can actually restart or reset or maybe create some warmth in this relationship. So that, I think, might start seeing some thawing or at least some exploration. Finally, the third dimension for Jordan is one that relates to, this is not actually the peace relation with Israel is not only bilateral, it's trilateral. And part of this triangle is the United States. And Jordan's main concern right now, that if you end up with a crisis in Jordan-Israel relations, but this might translate into a crisis between Jordan-US relations. So we'll see, and we're already seeing very kind of robust Jordanian action to basically prepare the ground here in Washington. If there is annexation, though, things will completely change. For Jordan, the two-state solution is a matter of national security interests. It's a matter of strategic interests. And at a minimum, if there is annexation, Jordan will go to the expected steps. There will be withdrawal of ambassadors. By the way, Egypt will do the exact same. Beyond that, though, the Jordanian reaction, again, will be based on or will be determined by two additional factors: how significant the annexation is. An annexation of all of the Jordan Valley, of major settlements, will elicit a strong Jordanian reaction. A smaller annexation might elicit a smaller reaction. And the other one is a domestic situation in Jordan. How secure and how stable it is. Today, as we speak, I think things in Jordan are at the best that they've been politically for a while. The Jordanian reaction to Corona has been exceptionally good, and the government and the system there is getting the benefits from that. However, if we end up with annexation, and if things by that time in Jordan start getting shaky, then Jordan might be pushed to take more drastic measure. So, I mean, in conclusion, I would say for all the three actors, the PA, Hamas, and Jordan, for their different reasons. In the short term, I think no one wants to rush into a conflict with this. However, if you end up with annexation, it's very hard for me to see how it can be business as usual. No one is going to rush to, again, go for violence. I think no one has an interest in that. But what we will end up with is a much more volatile situation where some of the kind of breaks that we've been having, some of the stabilizers that we've been having, will be out of play.
Great. Thanks, Ghaith. That was a great picture of both the Palestinian and Jordanian situation and how they view things. Dan had mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier in the conversation, and maybe later on we can circle back to that and talk a little bit about the role that they're playing. But I wanted to shift gears to the wider landscape and to Mara Rudman to offer some thoughts on US policy, how she sees it now under the Trump administration. I should mention that in February, you testified in Congress on the Trump plan and gave your candid assessment of the Trump plan, but then also offered some thoughts on the broader region. So there's a lot going on in that broader region in this year alone, with tensions on the Iran front, continued conflict in Syria. So everything we've been discussing so far in this discussion with Dan and Ghaith, how do you sort of assess US policy right now? And where would you recommend it going to be more constructive?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Brian, and Dan and Ghaith also for your comments beforehand. You've provided a great framing. And Brian, your question about where to see things going that are more constructive, you've given me a great expanse there, because given where we are now, we can only hope that it can get better instead of worse. from what our vantage point is currently. And what I would like to start with is something that I don't think that this administration has done sufficiently, which is for us to use as our set point what U.S. interests actually are, to remind us of how we should plan and frame for going forward, given where we are right now. What our interests are in terms of how we look at Israelis, at Palestinians, at the region, and more broadly, and apply those to the facts as they are currently. Because things are changing, have changed certainly in the region in the years that I've been working on these issues, and have changed particularly dramatically in the immediate stage that we're in, and are poised potentially, as Dan and Ghaith have pointed out, to change even more dramatically going forward. And so to apply precisely the same formulas that we have been all along, as if nothing is different, is not taking a clear enough look. So if I am trying to define U.S. interests, if I was currently a policymaker in this administration, strange a thought as that may be to everyone, including this administration, I would say that for the United States, the United States has an interest in a secure and sustainable Israel that is a clear ally for us in the region. And we have traditionally, as the United States, seen a secure and sustainable Israel as one that has a majority Jewish population and is a democracy. And that those have been central tenets of what we look at as part of a secure and sustainable Israel. I would also say that that we in the United States have a strong interest in the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, and in being seen as being able to pursue those legitimate rights for the Palestinian people, and in being able to safeguard those rights. And some of that goes to also what our broader interests are in the region and with regional actors, and you all have done a good job of articulating the broader sphere of things that are going on in the region currently, in terms of concerns about being able to counter Iran, about the various terrorist groups and elements that are ongoing there. Certainly Jordan and Egypt currently. Jordan may be, as Ray said, in a more secure position than it's been in terms of its domestic politics, but we know just how fragile things can be in Jordan at any given moment, given everything else that's swirling around in the region. And they have a significant Palestinian population. They're also housing refugees from throughout the region currently. And they have been doing an admirable job in a variety of ways with all the challenges they're facing, including how they're dealing with the coronavirus. But they will be the first front for having to absorb and deal with and withstand whatever happens with annexation. Egypt has been perhaps a step more removed than they had been traditionally, but they are also on the front lines, just a step behind perhaps where Jordan is in dealing with these issues. And then Saudi Arabia as well, and the rest of the Gulf states are. So while the Israeli-Palestinian issues have perhaps been a step off of the front burners from how we've traditionally seen them in recent years, I think we may have been lulled into a sense that these are not issues that can upset the regional balance until, and what we need to guard against is that they won't upset the regional balance until they have, and until something dramatic happens. And if we step back again into what U.S. interests are in being able to deal with the numerous other challenges we have in the world, as well as in that region, and not have our focus diverted to having to deal in a constant and ongoing way with issues between Israelis and Palestinians, and with the broader region being sucked into it, we are poised on the very edge of having exactly that happen again, because of the issues and decisions right now that the Israeli government is about to make in terms of annexation and what is happening July 1st. And so that's why I take us back to what U.S. interests are here, what may be guiding this administration, future administrations in how we deal with Israel on it, and in what our options are in dealing with it. And I don't want to take up more time right now, but I hope that the ongoing conversation leads us to talking more realistically about where Israel is, because I think no matter what we do, honestly, they are much more likely than not to go forward with annexation. I wish that I could buy into what some of Dan's more optimistic hopes might be about different things that might pull them back from the annexation decision. But I think that the majority Israeli polity right now is pretty far over the line in terms of what they will or won't do, regardless of what certainly this administration, the Trump administration, how it signaled where it might go, what Vice President Biden does or doesn't do. I think that I believe that the planning for the United States needs to be what happens if Israel proceeds ahead at this point, and what are our policy options at that point, and what happens in the rest of the region, and how do we handle it, and what do we do at that point, given where things are, and how do we protect United States interests going forward in the ways that I articulated at the front.
Yeah, that's great, Mara. Thanks for that overview. And I think it's a good segue into the next part of the discussion. I'm going to ask a few questions, but then we're already receiving some other questions, and we'll voice some of them here in the half hour we've left. And again, if you have any questions, you want to join the discussion, you can do so on Twitter at US Policy, hashtag US Policy in the Middle East. Please join us and bring in your questions. I want to bring it back to what is likely to happen here, or what should happen here. Dan, you mentioned, I mean, the basic message of what you said, and then a piece that you wrote in Haaretz last week, is that this could take a while. Mara has a slightly different view, and that maybe it could happen pretty quickly. And the common consensus, I think all four of us share, is that we're truly on uncharted territory here. And that Israel and this new government could actually make some decisions that could change the entire framework of how people have looked at this issue for decades. What do you think the US should do? What do you expect, to all of you who'd like to answer, what do you expect the Trump administration, in the event that there is more consensus inside of this Israeli government, that it moves forward with annexation this summer? What do you expect the Trump administration to do? What do you think would be best for voices in Congress, and then also those sort of who are running for president, like Vice President Biden? There's been already a lot of concern about this scenario. A letter last week from the Israel Policy Forum raised some concerns about annexation, echoing a lot of the concerns that are out there. So the main, what's U.S. role in this if Israel does proceed, and what's your take on it?
You want me to start, Brian?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Sure. Well, first of all, I really want to underscore a very key point Mara made, which is that the relative lack of drama or attention around this issue, which has let it drift from the center of the screen as we focus, of course, on coronavirus or on our rivalry with China or on other regional and global issues, is not something we should take for granted, and a shock like a major annexation that's recognized by the United States could obviously bring us right back to the fore. So this is why this is such a crucial conversation. I mean, the Israeli coalition agreement actually writes into its own language that the U.S. has a role, that Netanyahu can bring it forward to a vote in the cabinet of the Knesset by himself, but only if he has reached an agreement with President Trump on it. And so it's almost definitional that if it actually goes forward, it will come with U.S. recognition. Now, Secretary Pompeo said the other day that it would be Israel's decision, and the United States would not intervene in that decision, although would speak privately to Israel to express its views. One can read that more than one way about whether that's privately to try to dissuade them or slow them down or limit it, or whether it's simply to let them be seen as being in the lead on it rather than pushed by the United States. But I think, from what we've seen from the plan itself that was issued in January and the statements of a number of other administration officials, the expectation is, and President Trump may even see this as to his own political benefit, to energize some of his political base before the election. The odds are that if the annexation occurs, it will come with U.S. recognition. So then what will others do, or what should others do? I also underscore Mara's definition of what our interests are. That should help define the answer to that question. Interest in Israel's survival and security, and the partnership that the United States has with Israel, which has both a strategic and a moral dimension. The strategic dimension being our common interests against the same security threats, the intelligence and military cooperation and technology cooperation that benefits both countries. The moral dimension being more the bond of these two democracies and believing that there's a justness to the cause of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I think Joe Biden and I think most Democrats feel both of those are very relevant, and that in fact underscores the second one rather, the moral dimension actually underscores and what makes possible the first dimension, the strategic dimension. It's the values-based partnership between these two democratic countries and societies that ensures the long-term bipartisan commitment of the American people to a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And all of that is put at risk by the drift that seems to be ongoing and certainly would be accelerated through a large-scale annexation of Israel becoming a binational state, where it can no longer be both a Jewish and a democratic state. And so while with all the responsibility the Palestinians also bear for the stalemate, for previous failed negotiations, for violence, for incitement, that's just a reality. And so when if Israel takes steps, perhaps encouraged by the Trump administration, that's why the Trump plan, which doesn't describe a realistic two-state solution, and why unilateral annexation are really so damaging to U.S. interests. So I'd expect Democrats throughout this election season to speak to those issues. As I mentioned, Vice President Biden did so in his video address to the AIPAC conference, where he spoke obviously of his strong and enduring, decades-long commitment to Israel and its security, and his advice not to proceed with annexation, which undercuts support for Israel among younger Americans of both parties. I'd expect the Democratic platform to speak to strong support for this relationship and the partnership, and a strong commitment to a two-state solution, also to the rights of Palestinians to achieve self-determination in an independent state of their own, and calling on both sides to avoid the unilateral steps that each can take and sometimes have taken or might take that would make that harder. Now, the bigger question and the harder question to project out is, let's say it happens. Let's say those warnings are issued by Vice President Biden, by most Democrats in Congress, by Democrats through their platform, and yet Biden wins the election, becomes president in January, then has to make some decisions about what to do about the fait accompli of annexation and U.S. recognition. And those are very much dependent on circumstances, the scope of the annexation. Indeed, the expectation, or what the Trump administration seems to have previewed, is that they would recognize up to 30%. But there are scenarios where that becomes too heavy a lift with Arab states, with looking at what a democratic reaction would be, what the international community reaction would be, what the Palestinian reaction would be, and Israel decides to do something more limited, maybe annex settlement blocks that are more of consensus and that they would be likely to remain Israel in a two-state solution. Still unilateral, it's still very damaging to do those things outside of a negotiation and agreement, but it's a somewhat different problem for how you address it. So there are a range of options. There's obviously the withdrawal of U.S. recognition. There's looking for some other way to, through the publication of maps or U.S. plans or other sorts of balancing gestures or international consensus, describe or recommit to the more traditional model of the two-state solution. But those are decisions that I think really have to be left for much further down the road, when the details that an incoming administration would encounter are known. But the last thing I'd say is that I think it's very important that starting now, and certainly in that scenario of a new administration, we do need to be studying the alternatives to two states. They're all bad. I don't want to state that I'm at all happy about having to have that conversation, but it's something we've tended to avoid because there has been a consensus about the way we retain the core elements of this relationship and our posture in the region with a Jewish and democratic Israel as our security partner. If it's not going to be possible to sustain that through the achievement of a two-state solution, we need to understand what the alternatives are. I've done some work to help an organization called Israel Policy Forum, which did a study in the last few months on what the alternatives are, and really in a very systematic, rigorous way, scored the different alternatives: a one-state reality, a binational state that is not Jewish, a binational state that is not democratic, some Jordanian option, which is sometimes discussed, of Jordan taking a role in governing the West Bank or parts of it, and scored them against a number of criteria: security, Israel-Jewish character, its democratic character, Palestinian rights, U.S. interests, and they all score worse than two states. I'll stipulate to that. But it is critical that we try to understand better what those alternatives are, how we would try to protect and preserve our interests in any of them. And that's something that the U.S. government may need to do in a way it has generally avoided doing and left to think tanks and outside organizations to do so. So it's really important that we prepare for what that reality might look like. And the last sentence on that is, in preparing for the reality, because all those alternatives are so bad for our own interests and for the parties, for Israelis and Palestinians in the region, it might help reinvigorate the work toward a two-state solution as really the only viable outcome that can protect everybody's legitimate interests.
Great, thanks. We have a ton of great questions coming in here, and I thought maybe I'd turn to Mara to follow up on something Dan just said, and a lot of questions in this space of, well, what if the worst case scenario, Israel moves swiftly for an expansive annexation of the West Bank? Should the U.S., what sort of tools should it use? Should it leverage some of the assistance that it gives to Israel? I know you've talked about and you've dealt with aid throughout the Middle East in one of your previous positions at USAID. Does leveraging assistance in this sort of way actually produce the right outcomes? Is it something that should be considered? Are there other steps that should be at least voiced as they were in the Democratic primary over the last 6 months or so? What do you think?
Thanks. Well, I first want to double down on the point that Dan made about the importance of looking critically at what U.S. options are. If there is swift movement, I think, and again, I always want to plan for all scenarios, and so I think it's only prudent and smart for the United States to be planning for the scenario that Israel does move forward with varying types of unilateral action here, and that we should be prepared. We as a country should be prepared, and so I think this administration should be. I don't know that they are, but anyone who is running for office now should be prepared going in for what would happen and what their options would be. I think that cutting off assistance or threatening to do so is a terrible option, and I say this not just from the perspective of having spent a good deal of my time, both when I was at AID and when I was at the State Department, and when I've been at the White House as well, fighting to sustain assistance for Palestinians and for Israelis. Because generally you find that when you're the United States, being able to provide assistance, again, supports United States interests more than it supports the interests of the people you're giving the assistance to. Because what you're trying to do is move forward what we, the United States, want to accomplish, whether it's with Palestinians, in governance help, in economic help, in security assistance, all of which we have in the past provided for Palestinians, with Israelis on security assistance, going to the fact that they are key strategic allies for us in the region. So threatening to pull back assistance, or in fact pulling back assistance because different actors are not doing what we would like them to do, hurts us far more than it hurts those actors. And so it is, I think I can appreciate some of the tendency to want to go in that direction because people see it as the easy lever that we hold. It is in fact not the most effective one, because we hurt ourselves more than we hurt the parties whose behavior, if what we're trying to do is change behavior, we don't achieve that. And so I think what we need to look at is, again, going back to what Dan suggested, what are our options for the United States if this moves forward? I would take a step further back to say what we're trying to achieve is peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And what does that look like? And we will be in a one-state reality. I would say we are perilously close now to a one-state reality. And any annexation scenarios, certainly the 30% one, if you look at what a map does, brings you to that point. I think there are a number of scenarios short of that that bring you to that point. You have 14 million people. 8 million of them are Israeli citizens. Of those 8 million, roughly 7 million are Jewish Israelis. And so we are in a binational state with a control of the governance structures by the government of Israel, with different scenarios, I know, and different questions about, certainly by the Israeli polity, of who controls Gaza and in which ways. And I heard some inklings of what Ghaith was talking about and how Hamas may be perceiving it, that may take them a little bit out of that equation. I don't think that is particularly realistic. So I think the United States needs to get our heads around how Israelis are seeing it, how Palestinians are seeing it, and then what our options are if we are in an existence of some sort of one-state reality for a period of time. What different coalitions, both among and between Palestinians and Israelis, are there, and in the broader region, to shift the dynamic to find the path back to a two-state scenario that may take much longer than we're anticipating to get there. We may be talking again about a generation. And what's our plan over the course of that generation to get back to where we think it's most likely to get to a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians? The one thing I can tell you is that that path is not by withholding assistance. It's finding more ways to help people, not to take away help from people.
Yeah. So speaking of withholding assistance, we did an event at CAP, you can find online, in September of 2018, where we had a diverse group of analysts and leaders actually analyze the impact of the Trump administration's withholding and cutting of Palestinian aid, something, again, you, Mara, have been deeply involved with for many, many years. I want to shift a little bit to the region and sort of try to draw on some of these questions we've gotten online and maybe ask a question or two questions to Ghaith really quickly, and then maybe Dan and Mara jump in on this point. Mara was just talking about creating sort of a plan with the region and broader regional actors. There's an interesting question that came up, and I think it's worth throwing it out here. And it comes in, I don't know who anonymously, but I think it's interesting. At this time, essentially it's this, it's at this time of COVID-19 and crises around the region, how much does the Israeli-Palestinian question still matter? You know, and this is a question, and people raise it up, and maybe Ghaith, you can talk about it, because I think there's a general attitude. I certainly have seen it in parts of Israel when I was there recently in January, where it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Do you agree with the premise of the question? How would you answer that? Does this still matter? Are we focusing, and if so, why? If not, and then maybe secondly, and for all of you, and I'm happy to join in too, how do you see the broader regional landscape? Again, let's take sort of the worst case scenario of annexation moving quickly. Is there a prospect that the Jordanians and Egyptians or the Saudis actually may speak out more vocally on this move than they did, say, on the U.S. embassy move to Jerusalem? So, Ghaith, those two questions, we'll start with you, and then maybe Dan and Mara can chime in.
Sure. I mean, the question doesn't matter. Look, I mean, this is not a COVID-19 question. This is a question that's been ongoing now for a number of years, since the Arab Spring and all of these issues. One thing we know for sure, this is not as high on the priority list as it once was. This is, I mean, obvious. This is a fact. However, to kind of jump from that to say that it's irrelevant is, I think, a bit of a jump. And we've seen over and over how this has been able to actually mobilize, not necessarily the Arab street, but Arab leaders. We've seen on every step, whether it is the Jerusalem move, whether it is the UNRWA, cut off to UNRWA, whether it is the announcing of the Trump peace vision. In all of these cases, what we have seen, despite kind of messaging from some of the think tanks and sometimes even from places close to the White House, that, oh, the Arabs are going to come and support. What we've seen all the time, the Arab countries ultimately reverting back to their traditional positions in support of the Palestinian positions. After the announcement of the Trump peace plan, there were kind of noises being made that, oh, the Arabs will support it, or the Arabs will come and say yes. In the end, when the Arabs got together in the Arab League, they adopted the Palestinian position completely. Now one can argue They are being unrealistic. I've seen polls that say that the Arab public doesn't care as much. What really matters, and I don't know about the veracity of these polls, but what really matters though, when you look at Arab leaders so far have shown no willingness to basically take a risk on this issue. They feel more comfortable going where they are in the traditional position. Every Arab country has its own reason. What we see much in the Gulf is this interesting dynamic. For many of the Gulf countries, what they get, what they need from their relationship with Israel, they're already getting in this kind of under the radar screen, below the table, worst kept secret in the Middle East. So they're getting the benefits without the kind of risks and the price that they pay with taking politically unpopular positions. So I simply do not see this dynamic changing. Now, different Arab countries, of course, have their own different dynamics. Jordan, as I think all of us have mentioned, is the most acute situation, partly because of the Palestinian component of Jordan, but also partly because for Jordan, this is a larger issue that relates to Jordanian equities in Jerusalem, security equities when it comes to borders, things of these sort. And for Jordan, I don't think this is simply a messaging thing. I think it is a deep felt concern. Other countries might have a different position, but again, most Arab countries, I suspect, will be more comfortable going back to their traditional position because they see absolutely no value in taking a risk for something like this. And finally, the one last point here is, look, it's one thing if there's any Arab leader today who thinks that any big peace diplomacy has a chance of producing something. Then they might be willing to take risks. We've seen this in the past. We've seen Mubarak do it. We've seen Hussein do it. Today, no Arab official that I have ever spoken to thinks that any big diplomacy is going to produce a decision. They don't think Abbas can do it. They don't think Netanyahu is willing to do it. And therefore, in this kind of situation, do not expect anyone to kind of pay any political capital, to spend any political capital on a process that they ultimately believe is going to go nowhere.
Sorry, if I could just raise a question to Ghaith on that. I guess this is where the outcome or the expectations about outcome of the U.S. election, raise a different question. If Trump is prepared to recognize annexation and people are trying to maintain their relationship with him and not upend that apple cart, that's one scenario. On the other hand, for an Arab leader to be less opposed to annexation than a new president, the incoming president, if that's indeed going to be what happens, would that shift them just by definition of trying to sustain compatibility with a new administration's position?
I think what many Arab leaders will do is basically play for time. And we will end up with something even possibly similar to what we saw after the announcement of the Trump peace deal, which is basically two sets of messaging. On the kind of bilateral message or unilateral, when Arab states will come and say, okay, this is interesting, this is a setback, but let's see how we can move forward. So you'll have that in kind of individual statements by Arab countries. These will tend to be not official, maybe will be attributed to an unnamed official, etc., something of this sort, to basically create some sense to go to the administration, to come to Washington now and say, look, we're not really dissing you, we're not fighting against you. On the other hand, they would want to keep their, protect their other flank by taking a formal position in the more multilateral settings, whether it's the Arab League, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, United Nations, etc. So you will see most Arab countries will be trying to kind of maintain this balance, not to be stuck opposing this administration, and not to be in a position where, as you mentioned, Dan, where they will be actually, less pro-Palestinian than the next American president. I hope that this administration doesn't try to force the hand of some of these countries. And here, particularly, I would focus on Jordan and Egypt. Jordan and Egypt are two countries that have very important relations with the United States, important for U.S. interests, and trying to push these countries to take positions that might impact their stability will certainly not be in these countries' interest, but I don't think it will also be in American interest. Let's try, from Washington at least, to create a separation between how we approach this issue and how we try to maintain and bolster our important bilateral relations with key allies in the region.
Let me try to sneak in two questions in the 4 minutes we have left here. And the first is, again, to you, Ghaith, and then the last one will be to Mara and Dan. Ghaith, somebody asks, what if this unilateral annexation of parts of the West Bank happens, what does that mean for internal Palestinian politics, the durability of Abbas's rule? Would such a move actually bolster his rivals, whether it's Hamas or others that are part of the Palestinian Authority? And then I'll ask my second question after you answer that one.
Look, I mean, on the short term, we don't know. I mean, what we've seen, it's impossible to predict the reaction of the public. So on the short term, I really can't tell you. It might pass, and it might end up going to a complete security crisis. I just simply cannot predict. What I can predict, though, on the medium to long term, this will be the end of the kind of national secular movement among the Palestinians. Ultimately, the PLO and Fatah and the PA have all put their bets in one objective. And the objective, or the bet that they made, is diplomacy will produce liberation. And that's the whole idea of a two-state solution. If that possibility is out of the table, if with an annexation, a two-state solution becomes impossible or is perceived to become impossible, then the basic underpinnings of what the PA, what Abbas, what Fatah, what the kind of more moderate parts of the Palestinian side, the underpinnings with that will disappear. And for someone like Hamas, it will be a God-sent. From their perspective, the message will be very simple. Diplomacy doesn't work. The only thing that works is violence, and that's what we've been saying all along. So it will bolster that kind of thing. Will this happen immediately? Will it take a month, 2 months, 6 months? Will it happen as, will the trigger be an external event like Abbas's departure? We don't know. But what we know is we'll be moving into a qualitatively different phase in Palestinian politics, where those who call for diplomacy and a two-state solution are going to be on the defensive.
Yeah, great. Again, 2 minutes, so maybe rapid fire for Mara and Dan here. And I think it's an important question that's drawn in, and it relates to, I think, both of your work. What could a new U.S. administration do to re-engage the Palestinians? And understanding that question is asked in an environment of so much uncertainty, and no one knows what will happen. But what are the sorts of things you think would be wise to at least consider as policy options to re-engage the Palestinian people and help them sort of in the plight that they face economically and politically?
I'll go first, and then Dan can clean up here. Well, first, I would go to both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, because I think in both cases we need to reach out to a broader group and broader groupings of people than we have been. I think we need to understand much more than we do now about where, as Rafe said, where people are, meet people where they are as opposed to where we would like them to be. And I think that goes to the populations across Israel and populations across the West Bank and Gaza. Because I think we need to understand that and then figure out where current leaders are and where future leaders are going to be, just as a basis, figuring out to do the kind of planning that Dan has talked about. And I think on an immediate basis, we need to re-up assistance and figure out how to move assistance forward in tangible ways, and the kinds of assistance that's going to make and show a difference for people on the ground. At the same time, we need to figure out what is a reasonable horizon to be able to show to people. And there I have big hesitations, I have to say, about putting forward any kind of two-state planning right now, because that is not realistic for people who are on the ground, given what they are facing. You have to figure out what is a reasonable horizon that makes sense to people and that is going to be helpful for them. And deliver a way forward that looks to be a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and understand that that may be a very different configuration in the near term than we would like it to be. But show that that is something that we know is in our interest as well as in their interests, and be open to various configurations of what that might be and how we get there.
Dan, do you have any additional thoughts?
Well, I'd say I agree with Mara that there are some things that the Trump administration has done that I think are very damaging, that should be reversed. The cutoff of a range of forms of assistance to Palestinians for humanitarian and health and education and in economic development opportunities that aren't even affected by the legislation that was passed that correctly tries to get Palestinians to stop making payments to terrorists. That is something that should be reversed. The reestablishment of an independent diplomatic mission, a consulate general to the Palestinian that deals with the Palestinian Authority is something else that should be reversed. But more generally, I think having the United States establish its commitment that the two-state solution is its framework in which it pursues all of its policies, and it will judge the actions of all parties, and it will make sure its own actions are in furtherance of that objective, or at least not impeding that objective, needs to be at the center. And one way of doing that is to do something no administration really has done, perhaps with the exception of the Clinton administration, and only in its final days with the Clinton parameters, which is to put out a U.S. plan, a U.S. set of parameters for what a two-state solution looks like, not because it will necessarily get negotiations underway immediately. It may be impossible for the leadership of either side initially to accept every aspect of those parameters. It will almost certainly have to include things Palestinians have not yet accepted, like accepting Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state, and accepting that there isn't going to be any kind of return of refugees to Israel proper. It would also entail things Israelis have so far shown they're not willing to accept, such as the two capitals in Jerusalem for both states in a shared city. But I do believe that's the totality of that plan, and there are other elements, would remind people what the goal looks like, that's what the United States is going to be steering toward, even if it doesn't mean negotiations in the near term, to try to establish that as an international consensus, and make clear that when the parties are able to accept it, hopefully with the support or even the pressure from their own public, that those are the negotiations the United States will try to sponsor.
Great, Dan, that'll have to be the final word. At the outset, I raised the goal of trying to have this discussion and increase the quality of the debate, and all three of you helped us do that today. I only regret we don't have a few more minutes to take some more of these questions and continue the discussion, but this issue is not going away, and hopefully we'll be able to circle back to it in the next few months. So thank you for joining us at the Center for American Progress. Really great to see you, and look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.